So thank you, Rob, very much for such a kind introduction. It's both a great pleasure and a great privilege to be here and speak to you today. My name is Bob Hruška from Spark Systems Center Europe, and I am a principal consultant at Spark Systems with over 20 years of experience in using, building, and facilitating the model-based thinking to deliver systems and solutions that offer real value to our customers. The profession of enterprise architect is rarely taught as a separate degree course at higher education institutions, and it also suffers under the escalation of large, conflicting, and heavyweight frameworks and a lack of tool support. This had led to architecture practitioners finding it difficult to articulate or demonstrate the value of their profession. I think everyone can feel that. So I will address these questions in a webinar. What is enterprise architecture? What are the characteristics of good architecture? Why modeling enterprise architecture is essential? Where does it fit into the context of other disciplines? And you will also hear more about the levels, types, and styles of architecture that exists, and the notation mechanisms that are at an architect's disposal. If I ask you what types of architectures you know or you are aware of in IT industry, I think you would name a few by your heart. So, for instance, security, software, solution system, and so on and so forth. That would be endless list of architectures. And you know, the problem is that those are just terms without purpose behind. It's a little bit of pointless. But let me focus today on this specific topic, which is covered by enterprise, or which is dedicated to enterprise architecture. So what is it? Enterprise architecture has emerged as a critical discipline to ensure that an enterprise and the organizations it comprises have an understanding of the significant elements from which it is made, from strategic goals through to the business and information technology components that assist in achieving those goals. The discipline also allows enterprises to create architectures that will transform from where they are to where they need to be. No more than ever in this age of digital disruption, when organizations can no longer rely on length of operation in a field or being bigger than their competition as a safeguard against competitive forces. Enterprise architecture is a discipline, is vital. That's the message. Enterprise architecture can help steer the ship of the enterprise through both quiet and turbulent waters, charting a course from its current location to a future location in a safe and streamlined way. The discipline has become more prevalent in recent years, but the precepts go back almost to the beginning of what is often termed the information age. There is still a robust and lasting debate about what architecture is in the context of an enterprise, which makes it difficult to provide an universally accepted definition of the term enterprise architecture. This is not helped by the fact that there is not a standard curriculum for architecture or any of its flavors in our higher education institutions, nor do many institutions teach architecture at a graduate or postgraduate level. People come to the discipline from a wide range of backgrounds and produce an equally wide range of work products that come under the general heading of architecture. The ISO 42010 standard defines architecture as the fundamental organization of a system, embodied in its components, their relationships to each other, and the environment, the principles governing its design and evolution. In this context, the system that is under discussion is the enterprise. Using this definition, it is important to separate the fact that there is a description of the architecture, often called an architecture, and the architecture that has been built. An enterprise has a complex and typically hierarchical structure, and you will need to create architectures at the discrete levels of this structure. This hierarchy of architectures is analogous to the hierarchies of goals and capabilities and intuitively aligns with strategic, program, and project level divisions. In a small organization, it might be possible to create a single architecture that covers the strategic level and the project or capability levels. But what happens if you have a big enterprise? Well, if you have an enterprise of any appreciable size, at least 3 separate levels are typically needed. Naming of the levels has been influenced by the TOGAF. I'm talking about the strategic, tactical, and solution. The different levels of architecture will address different levels of concerns and have different audiences. The architecture framework and repository must assist in ensuring these architectures are leveled and synchronized so that they form a cohesive and balanced view of the entire enterprise. Strategic architectures describe strategic plans and initiatives and typically run for years rather than months. The strategic architectures must support or align with the enterprise's strategic goals, and tactical and solution architectures must help achieve the strategic architecture or run the risk of not being funded. Tactical architectures describe mid-range plans that help to partition the strategic level architectures into manageable groups. Solution architectures from a business perspectives are usually focused on a particular problem or opportunity. Similarly, from a technical level, they usually involve a slice through information, application, and technology areas, but might in some circumstances require a number of these to be addressed. The overall architecture of an enterprise can be described by 4 integrated sub-architectures. These are business architecture, information architecture, application architecture, and technology architecture. Most frameworks describe analogous of or similar subset of an architecture of an enterprise architecture, as the division is based largely on organization units performing work in these areas. There are a number of other architectures that could best be described as views. I think you've heard of the term architectural view, as they cross-cut and they are contained by the other architectures, but because of their importance, they are often raised to the level of an architecture. These include security architecture, geospatial architecture, and social architecture. A well-articulated business architecture is the cornerstone of a successful outcome of the overall enterprise architecture. It defines the business drivers, the business strategy, operational models, goals, and objectives that the organization needs to achieve to transition in a potentially competitive and disruptive business environment. Architects working in the other architecture discipline needs to understand the business architecture as the basis for their own architecture descriptions and as a guide to the business outcomes that have to be achieved. Information architecture is key to the success of an enterprise architecture program, as information is created, consumed, and destroyed by the components that make up the other architectures. So I think this quite nicely links to the other architectures, which are the cross-cutting edges, and the architectures defining the concrete logical model, conceptual model, and which can end up with the definition of a physical architecture. That's very important to keep the linkage. The application architecture provides an important catalog of the applications in the enterprise, describing the work that they need, they do to transform, transmit, and store the information. Usually there is a linkage between the application architecture and some UML type of models. What are the models? Well, I will tell you more about the models in a moment. So the technology architecture and the security architecture. First, the technology architecture underpins the other architectures, providing a description of the logical, physical, and virtual infrastructure that supports the execution of application services that in turn support information and business functions and services. And one of the most important ones, and one of the significant type of architecture when all those dots were connected and exposed on a worldwide network. I'm talking about Internet of Things. So the security architecture is a slice through all of the other architectures from a security viewpoint. So it really goes or consumes as an input from each of the architecture, from describing a different view and a different level of abstraction of your system. All the architectures mentioned will typically consist of a description of the baseline and target architectures with a series of transformations defined that can be executed, and that would be described, and roadmap diagrams described by roadmap diagrams. Architectures will only be successful if they are scoped correctly. So keep it in mind. The enterprise architecture body of knowledge, also known as EA book, describes three important aspects of scope, but another one can be addressed that addresses the importance of the stakeholders and success of the architecture program and the architectures it creates and manages. So those aspects are time scope, organization scope, detail scope, and stakeholder scope. Architecture time frames, organizational levels of detail and appeal to stakeholders must all be appropriately set to the architecture to be relevant and successful. It is difficult to define what the good characteristics of good architecture are when there are still vigorous and lasting debate about what the term architecture actually means in the context of enterprise systems in the 21st century. Well, the Roman architect Vitruvius defined three characteristics of good architecture in his treatise, De Architectura, written more than 2,000 years ago. So we have some stuff to learn still. Interestingly, it is the only surviving text from antiquity describing architecture. So let's come back to the principles. The principles are durability. It should stand up robustly and remain in good condition. Another characteristic of a good architecture is utility. So the utility, it should be useful and function well for the other people using it. And the last, beauty. It should delight people and raise their spirits. This is a good one, especially in IT. So these ancient characteristics can be elaborated on and expanded to apply to the enterprise architectures that are developed in the 21st century. The development of an enterprise architecture is a complex and time-consuming endeavor involving a multidisciplinary team of architects. Ultimately, the architectures must deliver value to the business, and this can only be achieved with the engagement of all the stakeholders. How to do that? Well, in this way, the chief architect needs to act in an editorial role, ensuring that business information, application, technology, security, geospatial, and social architectures are merged into a coherent whole. The architecture must act as a guide for the implementation teams, as source material for decision making, and as a description of a system either before or after it is built. So please differentiate between just the language, which, as you see, can be also defined by boxes and lines and some other languages, to something which can be called as a methodology, which really clearly defines the process, the steps needed to create the good the good architecture complying with the characteristics of the good architecture mentioned earlier. Okay? So the architecture process must be well defined, repeatable, and flexible to deal with the great variety of problems and opportunities that will be presented to the application. Fundamental to the execution of the process and the resulting architectures is the architectural team. So as I mentioned earlier, the term a model, so let me explain what that is. A model is an abstraction of the reality. In terms of modeling tools are operating here, are storing all the information relevant to the real world entities into the model, which creates a nice single source of truth, which is then visualized by using diagrams in a concrete context to address a concrete concerns of a particular stakeholder. So diagrams are drawings. Diagrams are usually created by tools, or you can even create the diagram by the simplest tool ever made, talking about pencil and paper. But once you store the information into the model, which is offering you consistent and organized manner, then it will support consistency, and it will also easier help you with governance to follow some concrete frameworks or modeling languages. While using visual modeling approaches on all of my projects, I learned an important lesson early on when I tried to find a single diagram that would depict all the important information about an enterprise. Does it exist? Well, I think you all know that there isn't one. Each model provides one concern of the stakeholders. Architectural viewpoints allow us to represent information at varying levels of detail and aspect, depending on how much information any particular audience needs. So the bottom line, do not try to draw everything or depict everything in one diagrams. What you're looking at is the Zachman framework, which is split as you see in the matrix. It defines a different viewpoints and different levels and diagrams illustrating and depicting concrete aspects of your system or of your enterprise. And that's the point. I found the concept of models helpful both for understanding the problem domain and exploring solution approaches. They are also valuable communication tools helping to bridge the gap between customer needs, architects who must understand the problem and conceive solutions. Therefore, we should use existing standard modeling notations whenever possible rather than inventing your own, as you see the animation. I hope you see the animation on the slide. Models are communication aids. We can only communicate effectively if we all speak the same language and understand the notation. If you invent new symbols, arrow styles, or other conventions you find convenient, the people who read your diagrams might not understand what you're trying to say. That only leads to confusion and not effective communication. An enterprise architecture modeling tool is best viewed as an operational unit of the business, and as such, it has a context. The tool must provide value to the business. It does this by ensuring that architectural effort is aligned with the strategic plans of the organization and that the implementation initiatives are carried out in such a way that honors the enterprise architecture. So try not to reinvent the wheel and try to make the modeling tool, whatever modeling tool you use, your tool and not the tool of the vendor. That's the message. Enterprise Architect has a number of convenient features to model and visualize the alignment of the architectures and the strategic plans. These visualizations can be used when assessing which information technology initiatives are contributing to the strategic business goals and objectives. So you clearly see the traceability, which one is doing which. In the digitalization time, what I also should mention is that it creates repository which is shared repository which supports the multi-user environment, and you can concurrently see what your colleagues are doing, and it supports also collaboration, and it supports the team spirit.
Okay.
I have a couple more slides and I'm done.
But time is done.
Oh, I'm so
Okay.
sorry. I just
Okay,
wanted to say it's not just a drawing tool, but it has also some BP simulations done, and so on and so forth. So I'm so sorry that I went over the time. So questions, comments in the meantime? I will just go through the slide. So as you see, there is just some simulation. There are a whole bunch of tools which support to model enterprise architecture and to concrete standards efficiently. And to be exact, there are just some examples how ArchiMate is implemented in the tool. And that's it of my presentation.
Okay.
This is my message. Please do not end up with this. Questions?
Thank you, Bob. Great presentation.